Thank you for inviting me. Good evening. Dobry den. I'm very impressed to see this many people here at 5 o'clock a Friday afternoon. That's very, very impressive. So, first for this evening, what I'd like to do is, my son has an expression, we will first zoom out and look at water from a broader overview. So we'll look at contemporary water issues. Then we will zoom in and we will look at the Columbia River and the 1964 treaty, which is an excellent example of transboundary water issues. And then after that, I'm hoping we can get into a full-fledged discussion of global governance and its limitations, look at some potential water wars, one in particular with the Nile River. And underlying all of this discussion, what is very important to me is that we, as citizens of the 21st century, continue to think about how we can protect our water resources and still govern in an equitable and just manner. One of the things you'll hear me talk about at the end is how do we include all the stakeholders in this discussion of water today. But first, what are the most contemporary water issues? And again, please let me remind you, this isn't a definitive list. You might think there are other issues more pressing. These are what I have identified as the most pressing contemporary water issues. At the top of the list, I'd say, is transboundary water issues. There's 4 river basins in particular. There are more, but 4 that I see as being very troublesome. The Mekong River Basin, where China wants to build about 15 more dams, which is, of course, going to jeopardize those water users downstream. The Indus River Basin, which is a very high conflict zone. The Indus River Basin, the Indus River is Pakistan's major source of water. They're an agricultural nation, and there's continued tension between Pakistan and India over this resource. The Nile River Basin, I will get into later on when I talk about the most likely I could see a water war occurring in the 21st century. And then the Colorado River Basin, which is internal in the United States, but because of climate change, is really becoming very troublesome. There's large areas that have experienced drought for 10 years now. The Colorado River is perhaps the most over-appropriated river, maybe next to the Nile, that I recognize for at this time. Another issue, of course, for contemporary water issues is water quality and access. And in each country you travel to, you see that that's a different story. I do a lot of research in Russia, which is also very water rich. I don't know if there's a place in Russia where you could turn the tap on and drink the water. Water quality is very, very much an issue in Russia, even though home of the Volga, these other great rivers over in the eastern part of the country. But water quality is an issue, and pollution, of course, infrastructure and delivery in many places is an issue, which is leading to another very charged argument, the privatization of water, and which is better for citizens. And then, of course, you have, and just recently has the UN really begun to address the climate change, and not just the UN, but other governing bodies as well, in that whatever we think about water being resource scarce today is only going to increase because of climate change. And by the way, when we talk about water quality and access, an interesting statistic for me, and I admit I come from a country that is very, the consumption for water is much too high. So I always have to remind myself, and I often talk to my students about this, when the UN talks about water access, they're counting someone that walks 45 minutes a day each way to get water for their household. They still are considered to have access. So those United Nations Millennium Development Goals, when they say that 1 billion people are without access to water, that's not counting the people that have to walk up to 45 minutes a day. Now, another issue is competing claims, in that everything, and we'll see this with the Columbia River case study, everything is ratcheting up as far as water. You have agricultural interest. You have, of course, industrial interest. Urbanization, the urban sprawl. You go to places like Johannesburg, and you'll see as that city's growing, there's not the infrastructure to deliver the water to serve these more growing urban interests. Indigenous, I'll speak about that a lot when I talk about the Columbia River, in that indigenous water claims are often ignored And there's a big push to include them, to have them more at the table as stakeholders. I'm going to talk about that. And another water use that's becoming more and more popular, higher demand, is recreational, and how much you continue to serve those interests as well. Now, with that said, let's zoom in and look at the Columbia River. And again, we're looking at this as a case study in transboundary water issues. It's considered by many political scientists, policymakers, as being one of the best models for transboundary water issues. I would agree, although I think that might change. In 2024, the treaty is going to be renegotiated between the United States and Canada, and it's not the pleasant environment it was in 1964, where I'll get to that more. It's the fourth largest river in North America. You can see it goes through 2 Canadian provinces, 5 states. And I'm going to talk about the physical characteristics for a few minutes just to give it a context for us to relate to it. It's 1,200 miles. As I said, it's international. What's important for when we're looking at the Columbia River Treaty, that's going to be renegotiated. This treaty is between Canada and the United States. Although Canada is the upstream water user, only 15% of the basin is in Canada. So maybe later, after we're done with the presentation, we can discuss that, actually what does give people more of a right, more of a claim, if you will, to this resource. Its major tributaries, and again, if you went to the American West, Pacific Northwest in particular is where this river is located. The rivers themselves, the tributaries, very, very large rivers. The Snake River alone runs over 1,000 miles. So it's a very large watershed we're talking about. Again, give you a few more of the stats. 160 million acre-feet a year is the annual average discharge. What's interesting is the geography of this river basin, in that you can go from places where there might be rainfall of 110 inches to places that are desert-like. Parts of the Columbia River Basin really do look like a desert. They might get, on a good year, 6 inches of rainfall a year. So you have a very diverse topography here as well. It drops an average of 2 feet per mile, some sections 5 feet, which is very important for hydropower. And it becomes, the Columbia River became at one time the most hydroelectrically developed river in the world because of this drop that it has. What's also going to be very interesting to us in the next half hour or so is the species of salmon. Anyways, the salmon species. Can everyone hear me all right? Now you can, can't you? I wonder if I should just turn it off.
No, because he needs it for translation.
Oh, he needs, okay.
I need it on
All right.
the
Oh, maybe it's my, okay,
This is now fine.
okay, all right.
You could also turn into a cabaret singer.
Did all of you hear what I said earlier, though? Okay, good.
Kokniye esoktu. Hold on to this as well.
Oh, okay. All right, there's 5 species of salmon, which we'll be getting to in a few minutes. And also, one of the things that this area, humans have lived there for over 10,000 years. So there still is a large indigenous population along the Columbia River. Little better map, give you an idea, and a few places I want to point out to you. I want you to remember, if you can, the Dalles. We have the Willamette, the Dalles here. The Willamette River comes in here, and up, way up north, you have a place called Dillio Falls. Just please kind of keep them in the back of your mind when we talk about indigenous peoples. Now, again, some of the things I mentioned, it's the most hydroelectrically developed river system in the world. At one time, I'm sure that's not the case now. Has over 400 dams on this river. 11 are on the main stem of the Columbia. This river, and one of the things I want you to think about for just a second, when I've read accounts about when explorers first came and even when indigenous peoples described this river before it was dammed, it was an amazing river. They talk about how loud it was and just the roar. You couldn't even hear someone speak. I mean, it was truly a wild, powerful river. Today you go to the Columbia River, it is a series of slack water ponds behind these dams. It is a tamed, engineered river. And I'm not saying that's all bad or negative, but there will have been trade-offs in gaining this tamed river. One of the big trade-offs, it does provide over 21 million kilowatts of electricity. Electricity is very inexpensive in the Pacific Northwest, in large part because of these dams. The dams were also built for flood control. It was not unusual for towns to be completely submerged and flooded. Navigation, you can now have barges go clear up the Snake River. Irrigation, and of course hydropower. Gives you a map with all the dams. And again, these dams, when you travel down the river, you can't go very far without seeing another dam and all the implications. Boy.
They turn out the other one.
I'm a technological. There. That okay? Is that okay for you? Okay. Okay. So let's look at the historical background. We've gotten the physical characteristics. Let's now look at the historical background. Again, as I said, we have evidence that goes back 11,000 years that you had inhabitants there. And these inhabitants, the beauty of the Columbia River, and one of the problems today, is salmon. Everybody that lived there depended on this salmon population to live. And salmon was so intrinsic in their culture that their myths, to give you an idea, the idea of the salmon, and when they first came to the Columbia, there's a story that for the Native Americans that lived there, it was coyote. Does everybody know what a coyote is?
Yes.
Okay. Coyote came and the river was blocked and the people couldn't get to the salmon. So what Coyote did, he tricked these sisters who were blocking the river and tricked them and opened the river up so that the salmon became available for everyone. Today, still, there are rituals associated with the salmon in this river. And the salmon, the story of the salmon themselves, they're anadromous fish. An anadromous fish meaning they can live in fresh water as well as salt water. Some of these fish, when they come back to spawn, to go up the Columbia before the dams were there, some of them went up 900 miles to spawn. And the stories about the salmon are also so rich when you read about the past. There's stories, I don't think I believe this one, but there's an account from the 1820s. One man said that he literally, his feet did not have a drop of water on them because he crossed the river and it was so thick, the word he used was lousy with salmon, that his feet never, I don't think it was quite that way. But the salmon were so plentiful, as you can see, 10 to 16 million fish. And again, I can't stress enough, or do it justice, I guess, in how intrinsic salmon were to this culture. For many tribes, salmon provided up to 1/3 of their caloric count. And there were 6 times a year that people would come to these 3 areas in particular that I pointed out earlier, Willamette Falls, Kettle Falls, Dillio Falls. They would come to these falls and harvest the salmon, which would for many, and then, as I said, be almost 1/3 of their calorie count. Now, the last one was the most important fishery, the Dillio Falls. And in this fishery, you had people trading. They had, remember where I showed you that one was in the middle of the state of Oregon. In Dillio Falls, they had people trading, and some would come as far north as Alaska would come down, come over from Montana, California. So it really, this place was very, very active at one time before the dam. And again, see where it says the Dalles is where Dillio Falls was, and then by Vancouver, you had another place. Now, just a few pictures to show you what it was, the river was like at one time. This was before the dams. And they talk, you read countless stories about the salmon jumping these falls to get upstream. And what's interesting today, and I'll get into more of this in a few minutes, but today they're trying to address this, and these are some of the issues with trying to balance the scales with dams. They're trying to address this by introducing fish from hatcheries, and poor substitute. They are very fatty. They don't even have the omega that's good for you for eating salmon. Not the same. They're not as virile a fish genetically. They're poorer stock than your native salmon. But the hatcheries right now are the only thing that we have, I guess, to try to rectify this. Again, these are old pictures. I just think they're interesting to see what it must have been like. Now, even the fishing was quite intricate. Many of the Native Americans, and even before the dams, you had a lot of white fishermen coming in there as well. They would stand at these falls, they would drop nets in there, bring up baskets of fish. I don't have the time to get into all, but it's interesting though, culturally, women were not allowed there. What women did was they smoked the fish or they sun-dried the fish. And what's also gets into all of the intricacies, they knew, of course, depending on where you caught the fish, the amount of fat. I mean, it was better to get the fish early on as they're going up to spawn than later. Kettle Falls that I pointed out to you, by the time the fish got up there, they were very lean, and the Native Americans that ate them, of course, that was one of the foodstuffs, but they would not be near the fish that you would get at that Dillio Falls or even the falls by Willamette River. Just some. And again, there was a ritual before they ate the fish. There was rituals of thanking Coyote, thanking others for providing this. And the point I'm making, again, with indigenous peoples, how water means different things to different people. And I guess that's part of my research as well, in that in a society that becomes a market economy, water becomes a commodity. And that's very different than what other groups might see. I think that's my last. See the fishermen. These were also dangerous ways to fish, if you can imagine. That's my last one. Oh no, that's another one last statement. Even the fish that are surviving are much smaller today than what they were. This is one of the king salmon, were the biggest ones, and you would hear these stories about these fantastic catches that you would see before the dams. Now, let's talk about one of the issues today that we're still seeing. Three Gorges Dam, of course, was just recently completed. But the 20th century is really when we begin to see this move to modernize, to produce hydroelectricity. Armenia, by the way, I was trying to do research because when I researched on the Volga, I found old 1930s, 1940s documents where there were hydro plans for Armenia as well. I think these were abandoned later on. Did they? No. Did the Soviets build some hydro plants here?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Maybe it was the biggest one that they were looking at that wasn't so. Anyways. But the U.S. and the Soviet Union were certainly the dam builders in the 1930s, 1940s, and 50s. Columbia River, 1934, is when you see Grand Coulee Dam begin to be built. Grand Coulee Dam was at one time the largest earthen dam in the world. I'm sure that's not the case anymore either. And then for the next 40 years, continue to see dams being built on the Columbia. As I mentioned earlier, by the mid-20th century, it becomes the most dammed river system, and it's the greatest producer of hydro in the world. Again, I'm sure that's not the case anymore. But it represents 40% of the hydroelectric power in the United States. Now, again, I want to give a balanced view about the Columbia River. especially before I get into the treaty negotiations between Canada and the United States. It has saved many towns. The flood control has been, of course, very successful. Many Americans point to World War II, that World War II would not have been won for the Americans, the Allies, had it not been the hydro that was furnished to 12 aluminum plants in Seattle, Kaiser Aluminum. This all happened during the war. Also, you see which Hanford Atomic Weapons Complex is right on the Columbia River. So Hanford was part of the plan when they developed the atomic bomb. And, as I said, the disastrous floods were stopped. But there have been costs. As I said, the salmon runs, they're down by 85%, which is very, very significant. The only thing I didn't mention, and I'll have a slide, what they have done besides the hatcheries, when the dams were built and they've tried to increase these, they have fish ladders for the fish when they're going upstream as well as when they're smolts and going downstream. The fish ladders, pretty ineffective, but there's another problem as well. If the salmon, the water temperature changes behind the dams, and, oh, question?
First, can we interrupt you?
Oh yes, please do. I'm sorry, I should have said that.
I just was interesting. What species of salmon was that?
Well, there's several. There's king salmon, there's Chinook salmon, there's kokanee. I can't think of the other two. Those are the three main ones.
And steelhead trout, right?
Can live in both.
Yeah, but okay. Thank you. So was steelhead trout gets mature in the river, right?
Yes.
So is it able to spawn not only upstream but also like in little creeks?
Yes, they do. That's but that's also a problem too, getting them to the creeks.
Like before the dam.
Yes, yes.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
And the shallow waters in the creek. The shallow waters are where a lot of them do with this gravel bed. So the fish ladders aren't working, and the other problem, as I said, is just even the water behind the dam. There's only so many days that the salmon have to get downstream, to get upstream, and the water temperature behind the dams is much colder than it would be without the dams. So that's a problem as well. So many of the individual fish runs are now extinct. There's also the radioactivity in the Columbia River from the Hanford plant. Pesticides, agriculture, Columbia River Basin is very, very rich. Wheat growing, grains, now vineyards, very rich, but a lot of pesticides are being dumped into the river. Some pulp mills, and of course different areas with industry, smelter tailings, as well as the eroded sediment from the dam. Now, Grand Coulee Dam is built 1930s, but the U.S., you still have, remember the Columbia River starts in Canada. The U.S. wants to build more hydropower, wants to regulate that in-stream flow, make sure they have enough water in the river, of course, to run these turbines. So the U.S. in 1964 enters into an agreement with Canada in that the U.S. would give Canada, once Canada built additional dams, would give them hydropower. And it's come to about $100 to $300 million a year in power generation that the Canadians have received for these dams that they built and helping to regulate the river for downstream flow. Benefits from 1964 up until recently, probably 80s, 90s, everybody pretty much on board about the benefits. Certainly flood control, hydropower, irrigation, navigation. But beginning in the 90s, especially this decade, you begin to see more and more complaints on both sides. Of course, one of the things, the First Nations in Canada, they had some salmon runs, but they were not affected as much. But the First Nations were affected. First Nations are the Native American tribes in Canada, were affected by these dams. Certainly Native Americans who have relied upon a healthy, robust salmon population have been very affected by the dams. And in fact, Native Americans would say, and this is accurate, that treaties were actually broken when dams were built, such as the one at Dillio Falls. And of course, the anadromous fish populations, there's negative effects. And again, you get a sense of all the dams and the ones in Canada. I'm just going to go through a few pictures of the dams and then talk about the discourse that's happening between Canada and the United States about the next treaty. This Grand Coulee Dam. On the left here is the fish ladders that they've tried. More fish ladders. And again, when you see these fish ladders, you're thinking, what were they thinking? How could, they wouldn't be very effective. What they've actually done in some instances, besides the hatcheries, you'll see sometimes they'll have trucks, and that they'll truck the fish around instead of using the ladders. Whenever fish they can catch, especially if they can get wild salmon, they'll truck them around to help them get upstream. They've gone to great lengths.
Fish transport.
Yes. Bonneville Locks and Dam, and in the treaty that's going, the treaty negotiations now, BPA, which runs Bonneville Locks and Dam, Bonneville Power Administration, is the main negotiator in the treaty now. Now, both sides, these are their concerns. Hydro, of course, and I'll get into a few of the concerns as well as a few of the criticisms as well. The treaty right now is not up until 2024, but by the end of 2014, if either side wants to continue the treaty, their comments have to be in, or their provisions have to be in by the end of 2014. If nothing's done, the treaty just wouldn't be renegotiated. So both sides are starting to make their preferences very clear, and there's been a lot of saber rattling between both sides. If you go back and look in Congress right now, there's a senator from Oregon who's saying things like, boy, these Canadians have had it way too easy, for too long. He wants to cut. Think about it. Canada's been getting 100 to 300 million a year. He wants to cut that, and that they'd only receive a third of the revenue that they've been getting. He said the dams are paid off. Why should we continue? Canadians on the other side are saying, wait a minute. When the dams were first built up here, we were told our only responsibility was to provide as much water as you needed for hydropower. That's all we were supposed to do. That's what the treaty was about. Now Canada's saying to the U.S., you're getting into ecosystem-based functions, because Canada's saying, they might sympathize with the Native Americans, but that's not, the dams where they're built, that's not their concern. So that's a problem. Canada's also saying, you are using this water and making these demands on water now to serve agriculture, to serve industry, to serve sports fishermen, to even serve residential real estate. Canada's saying it's a different ball game. So yes, we should still receive this revenue. I'm not sure how the end will be. Native Americans, which I'll get to in a minute, have their own claims as well. But the recommendations fall in these categories. Flood risk, ecosystem-based function, which is talking about, some people are going as far as saying we need to restore the historic fish runs. I don't think that's going to happen. But that's some people's preference. Water supply navigation. The last one is of particular interest because now both sides are recognizing that climate change is going to make for a very different river. The Columbia River goes through some very dry areas that support vineyards, that support grain, and even their irrigation. I don't know how many of you studied with irrigation, but they still use the old center pivot, kind of irrigation, the big wheels. They're not conserving water as well as they might, so I'm sure that will be an issue as well. So, again, the different perspectives. Canada, of course, wants that hydropower revenue, and it does. it's given Canada billions. And of course, Canadian dams do serve additional purposes. The U.S. wants to include Native American issues. They want that to be on the table. And the indigenous peoples are saying, wait a minute, and they want eco-based function to have the same priority as hydropower and flood management. They're asking that that be given the same, it's in the same hierarchy, the same priority as the other two.
Can you explain a little bit what eco-based function?
Oh, the idea that you would have an ecosystem that would support these historic fish runs is what they're saying. So in-stream flow, you would have to keep the river, keep more in-stream flow, but to support the fish population and that riparian habitat, rather than to just keep those generators going. They also want spring and summer flows to be stabilized, and again, that's to support the ecosystem, to also support to continue to try to revive this fish population, and then the fish passage to historic locations. Again, you can kind of narrow down 4 areas. And the ecosystem functions also, you can fold in climate change into that becomes a consideration for this 2024 treaty. Now, let's zoom out for a minute and look at transboundary river issues as a whole. One of the things that more and more political scientists, journalists are talking is that you need to include all the stakeholders. To have governance work, everybody needs a seat at the table. Okay? And also, that ecosystem preservation needs to be a priority. If you don't have a healthy river, it's going to become moot. And again, you still see the arguments between commodification and intrinsic value. There's a big discussion, and again, this discussion, I don't know, maybe we can get into it. I'd be interested to hear your views about how much agency do we give to nature? Do we give nature agency? Do we give the Columbia River agency? And it's something worth considering. Now, along those same lines, there's a limit to global governance. Canada and the United States right now, the two entities that are negotiating, both come from governments that are stable, secure at the moment, and that's going to make a difference in governance. When we look at the Nile River, that's going to be a problem. But with global governance, for it to succeed, you do need to collect data. I mean, integrated water resource management is really the goal. I think probably all of us would share. But to have that, you need to have data, you need to have monitoring, and most of all, you need to have enforcement. Because if you say we want so much river to stay and so much water to stay in the river, if there's no one there to monitor and enforce that, again, it's just nice words. And also with meeting transboundary water issues is the idea of demand and trying to meet new demands as well. Any questions before I move on to the next? Sure. I feel like I'm zipping through this, and if you have questions.
On that ecosystem function restoration, what we basically,
On the ecosystem function restoration, what we basically mean is knocking down the infrastructure that's built, right? How else do you restore the functions?
No, but I mean, I agree. In an ideal world, yes, you would take down the dams.
How is this being put on the table as a realistic thing to talk about? What are the options?
There are discussions about taking down some of the smaller dams, which again, I'm not sure how realistic that is. But the main thing right now is letting that water go through so that you have a high enough stream flow to accommodate the fish population, that you're not holding it back. That would be the main. Another thing too, by saying that, you have a lot of irrigators in the Columbia River Basin, that water would be secondary to this ecosystem-based function. And vineyards, you have a lot of vineyards now, that also would be secondary. So, but there is talk about the smaller dams.
What is the percentage of water that is taken for irrigation? percentage of river?
Now what is, I'm sorry. I didn't-
What is the percentage of, what is the share of river
Oh.
that is taken for irrigation?
Well, that depends. I mean, the big project that was built on the Columbia River Basin was United States Bureau of Reclamation, and they would measure it, and I don't know, each place might be different, but it would be so many acre feet per acre of water is the measurement they would be using. So, and they would pay for that, but it would depend on how much land you have, you know, how they've judged how much you would need. So, does that help?
Well, no.
Okay, well,
Well, in total, like annually, is it, let's say, 10% of the river?
oh,
that
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Well, for the Columbia River, it could be. I don't know the exact, but agriculture would be one of the major users. That would definitely be the case. And right now in the hierarchy, agriculture might be second to hydro. I could see it being considered the second most important use. Any others before I jump into the Nile? No, that was a good pun, wasn't it?
I was wondering if there were any public concerns or from, the public and how they were treated by the government. If the public,
You mean indigenous peoples?
yeah, not only. I mean, I don't think ordinary Americans. I think they also care about healthy rivers.
Oh, I agree.
Sorry for my voice.
So like environmental movement?
Yeah.
Well, that's where there is a mix. And there are environmental groups, like International Rivers Network, for example. But there's other local NGOs that would be interested in protecting the river. What's interesting in the politics there is many people want to protect the river so they can recreate, for recreational purposes. There's probably less people who see the river just having intrinsic value in and of itself. Not that they don't exist, but their voices are not heard as much. And there is criticism, though. There is criticism of the dams. There is very much criticism of the dams and criticism of what's happened to the salmon population. Many people are unhappy about that. But there's also a lot of controversy about who should have the right to, whose rights should prevail. Does that help or make sense?
Yeah, I just was wondering how did the government treat those people who were complaining about the situation?
Okay. Well, in the
Did they sit together to discuss, or they were ignored?
Yeah. Well, in the 1930s, of course, it was the Depression, so when the dam was built in the 1930s, more people were for it than against it because it gave people jobs. And in the 1940s and 50s, that whole Columbia River Basin was actually a project for returning veterans from World War II. They gave veterans the rights, homestead rights, to farm in that area. So it was still supported in the 1940s and 50s. In the 60s and 70s, when environmental politics become more noticed, more discussed and controversial, you would have complaints then. People would complain about what's happened.
What is the current situation with that?
It's really interesting, and I'm glad you asked that, because people, where I live in Washington, the general population would be for keeping the treaty intact, but not giving Canada as much money, which is, that's probably all, most Americans would probably be in that. But we tried to give, just a personal note, we tried to give a conference last month, and I was working with a colleague from Washington State University, which is a research institution. And this conference, we wanted to talk about the Columbia River Treaty. We invited people, and he had a lot of money to pay stipends. We're working with UNESCO. He's going to become this UNESCO chair. And the only reason I'm telling you this is to just show he was very legitimate. He sent out invitations to the tribes involved by the Columbia River and also to Bonneville Power administrators. They did not want to come because it was such a controversial subject and at such a delicate time in the treaty. So those closest to the treaty are not saying as much, except for some, like the senators saying we need this or we need. So it's interesting. There's just a whole mix. And even my students, when they've talked about Columbia River, some of my students are angry because there's not enough salmon, but yet they also say, but you know, we really like having this cheap electricity. So there's really a mix.
Is there, I was going to ask, this treaty right here.
No, I know, my daughter's just coming in and I was looking at it, sorry.
Yeah, these treaties, do they have public participation?
Oh yes,
in them?
they do. They have forums where, where people can come and speak. Should I turn to the, oh, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, that's fine, I'm glad. That's,
Both species, Chinook salmon and king salmon, they become mature in Pacific, right?
yes. I think they stay in 2 years in the ocean,
Yeah.
yes.
Is there any research about their population and fishery on their population in Pacific? Because you might like work to protect them in the river, but in reality they are all fished in the ocean.
You're absolutely right. And there is a lot of criticism about that as well. I mean, you even have Japanese fisheries get into those waters as well. That's a problem. And of course, though, a lot of people now in the United States, for salmon, rely on Alaska. You know, so, but you're right. There has been a lot of study about that, the overfishing in the oceans. That's a good point. I'm glad you raised it. I might not get to the Nile. That's all right.
You were speaking about, I just want mainly to ask a question about the water quality of Colorado. Just because, okay, you said that, sorry, yeah, okay. So it's just for irrigation, right? And I just wanted to know whether there are any studies about the water quality. Maybe I'm also asking this question because I'm thinking about the fish population, because we all know that the salmon requires like what we call biological demand of oxygen, right? So if the rate of the dissolved oxygen is good, the fish will definitely be there. So the same is like, that's why I'm asking this question. And you also said that it's, is that like the waters are used for drinking water or not?
Oh, in Colombia?
No, I mean, yeah, in any kind of city which is like situated near the river.
Oh, I'm sure there's some that the waters are used for domestic consumption.
Uh-huh, okay.
But was your question about the Colorado River?
No. I was talking about
Oh,
Colombia. Yeah, and I was asking whether there are any studies about the water quality, mainly for irrigation purposes, so drinking purposes now, and about the fish, like because there are different standards for fish, for irrigation, and for drinking water.
Well, I do think, I mean, there are cities that rely upon it for domestic consumption. But of course the irrigation has hurt. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of the water treatment plants. Also, the quality is going to hurt the salmon as well. And what's unfortunate, we don't even get to that place as much because they're not, you know, because of the inability for them to get upstream. But should I move on to the Nile?
Jump into the
I'll jump into it. Okay. All right. Let's look at the Nile. I'll be brief because we've spent a lot of time, but I do hope you have some comments about this as well. The Nile is the one I chose for another case study, and that, as I said earlier, if there is going to be a water war in the near future, I would put my money on the Nile. When I read about it, I'm always amazed that more hasn't happened already in this area of the world. The river itself, you know, it's like the second longest river in the world, I believe. Most of the water volume comes from the Blue Nile in Ethiopia. You also have the White Nile. The stats, 160 million people from 10 countries rely upon this river. And within the next 25 years, when I think about this, I'm always just amazed. The population is expected to double. I mean, there's barely enough water as it is right now, and it's expected to double. Right now, they're going on a treaty agreement that was made in 1929. I think there was another one that was developed in the 1950s. But in both of them, Egypt receives the lion's share of the water. So 55.5 billion cubic meters. And next to Egypt, the Sudan receives 18 billion. Between these two countries, 90% of the Nile's flow goes to these two countries. The reason it was set up this way, my interpretation, others agree with this, but is that Britain, this was a colonial legacy from Britain being in the area. Two things, the Suez Canal was being built around this time, or control of the Suez Canal was being sought, and they wanted to grow cotton in Egypt as well. So Egypt was definitely, Great Britain helped in this treaty to ensure that Egypt would receive the majority of the water. And Egypt itself also believes that they have a historic right to this water. You know, Egypt's called the gift of the Nile, and that there is this precedent, this historic use to their receiving this much. Now, in 1910, the Nile River Basin states did sign an agreement to more equitably distribute this. And by the way, the 1920 and 1950s agreement said nothing major can be done without Egypt's consent to the Nile. No major shifts in the appropriation. Not surprisingly, Egypt and Sudan did not sign this. And Egypt, again, reserves its right to protect the Nile. But Ethiopia in particular is going to be a problem in this area in that they're building a huge hydropower dam called GERD, G-E-R-D is the acronym. And Ethiopia is moving ahead. The Egyptians have asked them to stop, negotiate before they continue constructing this. They've refused to do that, and they continue to build. Now, what's made all of this unsettling is when Mubarak was in power. Mubarak, of course, had such an iron hand over Egypt and the area that they had engineers, they regularly monitored the Nile, they monitored whether people were taking more than their share of the water. There's no one doing that anymore. So without that stable government in Egypt, the control that Egypt once had over the Nile is lost. Also, population growth just in Egypt alone is going to skyrocket up to 122 million by 2050 is the projection. Ethiopia's population also 150 million, and Uganda, another user of Nile River water, is supposed to reach 97. A lot of potential for this being a high conflict zone. And again, you can see the countries that border. And I think Egypt, I want to say Egypt only borders 10% of the Nile, whereas these other countries. And the majority, the flow comes from the Blue Nile in Ethiopia. So, what's going to be needed? I think Egypt's going to have to include all the stakeholders when they revisit the treaty, but also this idea of cultural value, traditional knowledge. They definitely need more sophisticated data gathering, and the UN and other agencies are going to have to become involved, and certainly population growth and climate warming is going to have to be a consideration. That's it. I'm actually done. So, now, questions.
You can also ask about the gold bill, but no, that's not.
Oh, sure.
The question is regarding the upstream and downstream countries, agreements between those. I know that, I think in Scandinavia, there's kind of an agreement that downstream countries are paying to upstream ones for provision of higher quality water, and you know, there's some kind of an agreement. So what do you think about this, and how do you see the future of this? I think this can also become a good tool for solving of some political issues. And of course I'm talking about Armenia and Azerbaijan and maybe other countries, because we are the upstream country of the region. and our neighbors are not happy with the way we manage our water resources. So do you think any kind of future for this?
Well, I think that's a wonderful model if people will agree to this. The other thing that the realities are, politically, who has the power? I mean, that is one of the issues. I mean, I think the model is good, but I think for that model to be effective, you will have to have stable governments in place. You will have to have, again, as I'm saying, the data gathering to ensure, I mean, for example, the Colorado River. Those upstream users in the Colorado River have very little water. California has most of that water. But California doesn't pay very much, but California is like this economic machine that just, so yes, I think the model works as long as you have the actors there that can implement it and monitor it.
And are there any other examples of it?
Of that, not that I know of, no. And the ones that I showed that are trouble spots, like Pakistan, and actually, I want to say Pakistan, the Indus River does flow mostly through Pakistan, but again, it's because India has the political clout that they're able to exercise more control. So, but that's a good model. I would look that up too. Well, one other thing too, just to mention for models, in the United States, water law, in different states, water law is that I could have the river run, in certain states, I could have the river run right by my door in August, but someone else downstream made a claim on it 100 years before prior appropriation, which just seems, and I don't know if Armenia, what the water law is. Is it riparian here?
Yeah.
Okay.
What are the incentives for an upstream country to join the Water Convention? You know, the Transboundary Water Convention is under discussion now. Why would an upstream country be interested in joining it?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, you know, if you want to be a good global citizen,
Just goodwill.
well,
And money too, maybe.
money, and certainly the model that he mentioned, if you could ensure that the downstream users paid more, there'd be economic incentives. But I think that's a good question for China. I mean, with the Mekong, you know, because you know, the countries downstream whose livelihoods depend on that, whose livelihoods depend on that as well, what is the incentive for China to serve that?
Yes, how to silent automatically.
Put your earphones on.
Oh.
Is it on? Matt, mi banasa? Can you hear?
Well, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You hear me?
No.
Կարաս մի քիչ խոսես, Խաչի։ Բանկան, you know hearing?
No. Is he saying something?
Yeah, he's trying to.
Just translate on the spot.
Okay, whatever.
Okay.
This one is working, so you can.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'll put it up high. Perfect.
Երկու հարց է, եթե կարելի է։ Առաջինը էլի հոսանքնի վեր եւ հոսանքնի վար երկրների մասին։ Մենք սովորաբար խոսում ենք հոսանքնի վար ի վեր երկրների պատասխանատվության մասին։ Որտեղ մենք պետք է հաշվի առնենք նաեւ հոսանքնի վար գտնվող երկրի կարիքները եւ նրա բոլոր հարցերը։ Բայց արդյոք կա ինչ-որ պարտավորություններ հոսանքնի վար երկրներում, որպեսզի նրանք էլ ջուրը օգտագործեն պահպանելով հետագա ջրի մաքրությունը եւ այլ բոլոր պահանջները, որ ներկայացում է ջրի։
Okay. Okay. Is this on?
It's on.
That's a good question. And one of the things I didn't get to is that more and more the United Nations and other global units are saying that, well, in the United States, for example, but other countries, you have Clean Water Acts, you have other legislation that applies to all, upstream and downstream users. So I think the move is on that there's an idea of stewardship, if you will, environmental stewardship, that regardless of whether you're upstream or downstream, you're responsible for the river's health. And even the United Nations Millennium Development Goals talks about things such as water, water purity, you know, the pollution, those.
Երկրորդ հարցը, հավանաբար վերաբերվի Կոլումբիա գետին, որպես զարգացած երկու երկրների սահմանագծին հանդիսանային գետ։ Արդյոք կա Ամերիկայում, Միացյալ Նահանգներում կամ Կանադայում, որ որոշակի օրենք կամ ինչ-որ ստանդարտ քաղաքային տեխնաջերերի մաքրման կայանների տեղաբաշխման վերաբերյալ։ Այսինքն դա պետք է լինի քաղաքից վերև, ջրի շարժման ուղղությամբ, թե քաղաքից ներքև։
That's another good question, and that's one that's debated a lot in how vigilant communities are about their sewage and their waste disposal. Many communities are not as vigilant as they should be, particularly during times of recession in the economy. The environment is the first thing to go. Environmental concerns are the first thing to go. But we do have certain standards internationally. Another river that's a transboundary river, which I didn't mention, the Colorado, I should have mentioned this, even though it's in the U.S., 25 million acre feet of the Colorado River has to be delivered to Mexico at the end. That 25 million acre feet, by the time it gets to Mexico's borders, is so saline, so polluted, they have to run it through a desalinization plant just to give Mexico, you know, water that's fit or clean enough. So there are standards, but cities, the problem is that states and cities have their own municipalities, so there's not, besides general laws like the Clean Water Act, there's no enforcement internationally. And I'll give you one example. During Ronald Reagan's administration, there was an environmental protection agency that was supposed to protect our rivers, protect the air, etc. Well, he kept the law there, but he only had 20 people working in the office, okay? So there wasn't any monitoring it. The law's there, but there weren't enough people to...
I want to ask about Turkish politics, about the rivers Tigris and the Euphrates, because I know that agriculture of Iraq is in very high demand on that, and Turkey
Yes.
constructed very high dams and very big dams, and in summer they just don't give water to Iraq, and it is very crisis situation. What you can say us about this?
That's the Turkey and Iraq is another high conflict zone. I'd say it's very comparable to the Nile. Right now, Turkey has the power that they, and I can't remember the number of dams they built. It was the Tigris River, Tigris and Euphrates rivers that they built it on. But unless, again, there's a global governance model that works, I don't know how Iraq, I mean, there's no one, if you will, no agency that can ensure them having the water that they should have downstream. So, but that's another high conflict zone, without a doubt.
So war tends to be the only solution in these cases?
Well, it's the solution is a global governance system that works. I mean, and the United Nations does do things such as supports integrated water resource management, but many people, and a scholar, Ken Conka, writes about this, he finds that still inadequate. And what he sees the hope for the future is that you're going to have more NGOs, and that, for example, when you have a dam being constructed, You have NGOs, and NGOs, by the way, are, which we all know, are industry in themselves. I mean, the amount of revenue they're generating, they're like a third government, if you will. But NGOs are going to weigh in and are going to help resolve some of these problems. Also, Ken Conca believes that instead of making issues as international, you're going to have to go back and do more of a regional approach. And of course, his ideas too are that the idea of the stakeholders, bring in more stakeholders to the table.
Has it helped to have like a supra-state, like European Union structures, like the Danube? Has it improved the Danube?
Oh, I mean, Europe's rivers really are fairly clean. I don't know if it's because of the European Union. I'd say it's more that there's an ethos there now with the Danube and the Rhine. I would say there's more of a stewardship that's shared.
So it's not the governance structure, more that there's a culture.
Well, I mean, and this is my suspicion that.
Ես մի հարց կոնդրում եմ, նորից վերաբերվելու եք էքսաջերելի։ Ես ասեմ, որ խսան տարիների մեր նորմը, էքսաջերի մաքրման նորմը ընդունվել էր հետևյալ տրամաբանությամբ, որ ավելի լավը մի քանի խոշոր քաղաքների համար կառուցել խորը մաքրման կառուցվածքներ կամ երրորդային մաքրումով կերտաջուրը լցնել, մաքրումից հետո կերտաջուրը լցնել գետ, իսկ փոքր քաղաքները, գյուղերը կարելի է չմաքրել կերտաջուրերը, քանի որ վերջի վերջո դա կբերեր միջինացման։ Այդ մի տարբերակ։ Հիմա այսօր Բեզմոտ Հայաստանում դա մտածել այկերպը դեռևս որոշ չափով պահպանվել է եւ կարող է պատահել եզնում արդեն ձեր կարծիքով դուք ոնց կվարվեիք արդյոք կգնայիք խոշոր քաղաքների կերտաջրերի խորը մաքրումով եւ գետը լցնելով թե ավելի լավ է համատարած բոլոր բնակավայրերում որոշակի աստիճանի կերտաջրերի մաքրումն ապահովել։
That's a hard question. Очень трудно. Я не знаю.
Maybe you could bring an example from any countries that you know, how it works in the US, how it works in Russia or other places that have been.
Yeah, I can't think of an example. I mean, the only thing I think you'd have to do more of the Soviet Union's initial reactions, what they did initially, just because I studied the Volga, they did so many stopgaps that aren't working. And the other thing I noticed when I studied the Volga, which doesn't answer your question directly, but the science that, talking to some of the scientists at the Volga, again, they had inadequate data for a lot of what was happening to the river. So I'd have to know more, I guess, about both methods to really answer that. And I'm sorry. Izvinichia.
Yes, Pastori մասած են վերաբերում Վոլգա գետի վրա, քանի որ դուք ասացիք, որ դուք Վոլգա գետը ուսումնասիրել եք, իսկ խսրամի ժամանակ նորմը կազմվել էր օրինակ վերցնելով Վոլգա գետը, դա հիմնական աղտոտված գետն էր։ Եվ նորմը կազմելից իրանք որպես արենցիր, որպես օրինակ վերցրել էին Վոլգայի մաքրության հարցը։
I did not see a lot of evidence of that, okay, of the Volga being cleaned, in that the places I studied, and it was not definitive, but you still had a high amount of effluent coming out of industries into the river. The fish, I studied different species, that there were mutations in the Volga because of the industry, the effluent, and there is a group in Russia now called Save the Volga, which is trying very hard to clean up the river. But I didn't see the evidence of the Volga. The rivers more on the east of Russia, I would say, were probably cleaner than the Volga.
Questions, Arthur?
I'm curious whether there has been any research done on climate change impacts on both river basins, and under the UNCCC, whether there has been any plan, any kind of adaptation plan for building the resilience in the watershed, and if climate change is also mainstreamed into decision making for watershed management.
Is this now for the Columbia or for in general? 'Cause
For Columbia and for
Columbia, they're starting to do studies, and particularly out of the Bonneville Power Administration, you can find, there's been congressional hearings, but I don't know what the specific recommendations are, just that it needs to be included in the negotiations. But also, as recently, I want to say, and there's a lot of controversy about this too, there's a forum called World Water Forum. Anybody familiar with the World Water Forum? Where there's been some research, and every year they have a meeting, and sometimes they have 5,000 people attending these meetings. They have issues like that on the agenda, but there's a lot of controversy about them dealing with this because the World Water Forum, which is trying to be another example of global governance, has also private water companies there. They have civil engineering companies there. So it's who's interested driving this. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thank you very much, Dorothy.
Thank you very much.